What if I told you that the toxic people in your life are not actually your biggest problem? I know that sounds strange, because maybe right now you're thinking about that person who constantly criticizes you, manipulates you, disrespects you, drains your energy, or makes you question your worth. You may believe that if they would just change, your life would finally become peaceful. But what if the real issue isn't their behavior? What if the real issue is that they've discovered something about you that you haven't discovered yet? They've discovered which buttons to push. They've discovered which words trigger your emotions. They've discovered how to occupy your mind long after the conversation ends. And every time they succeed, they take something from you that you'll never get back. Your peace, your confidence, your focus, your emotional freedom. The shocking truth is that toxic people don't have power because they're stronger than you. They have power because most people unknowingly hand it to them. But that ends today. Because in the next few minutes you're going to learn 8 life-changing rules that can completely change the way toxic people affect your life. These are not the typical feel-good lessons you've heard 100 times before. These are deeper. These are psychological. These are practical. And if you truly understand them, you'll begin to see toxic people differently than you ever have before. You'll stop reacting the way they expect. You'll stop playing games you can never win. You'll stop carrying emotional burdens that were never yours to carry. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why some people seem impossible to manipulate, impossible to intimidate, and impossible to control. Stay with me, because the final rule may be the most important lesson you've heard all year, and once you understand it, toxic people will never have the same power over you again. The first rule is simple to hear, but incredibly difficult to practice, and that is this: stop giving toxic people control over your emotions. Most people never realize that's what's happening. They think the problem is the insult. They think the problem is the criticism. They think the problem is the disrespectful comment, the passive-aggressive remark, the manipulation, or the constant negativity. But those things are rarely the real problem. The real problem begins the moment another person gains access to your emotional steering wheel. Think about that for a second. The moment someone says something rude and your entire mood changes, they've taken control. The moment someone's opinion ruins your day, they've taken control. The moment you spend hours replaying a conversation in your head, thinking about what you should have said, what you should have done, and how unfair it was, they've taken control. And most people hand over that control without even noticing. They wake up feeling good, confident, focused, and motivated. Then one interaction with a toxic person changes everything. Suddenly their energy is gone, their focus disappears, their confidence starts shaking, their mind becomes occupied by someone who probably isn't thinking about them at all. Now here's the uncomfortable truth. Toxic people are often much less interested in being right than they are in getting a reaction. Because reactions are power. When someone can make you angry on command, they have influence over you. When someone can make you defend yourself constantly, they have influence over you. When someone can determine whether you feel good or bad about yourself, they have influence over you. The greatest mistake intelligent people make is assuming every problem can be solved through explanation. They believe if they just explain themselves clearly enough, eventually the toxic person will understand. But many toxic interactions aren't misunderstandings. They're power struggles disguised as conversations. And you cannot solve a power struggle with endless explanations. You solve it by refusing to participate. One of the most powerful mental shifts you can make is realizing that not every emotional trigger deserves your attention. Just because something grabs your emotions doesn't mean it deserves your energy. Think about how often people react automatically. Someone criticizes them, they defend themselves. Someone insults them, they attack back. Someone doubts them, they start proving themselves. It's almost mechanical, predictable, automatic. But real emotional strength begins the moment you create space between the trigger and the response. That's where freedom lies. A toxic person says something provocative. Instead of reacting immediately, you pause. You observe, you think, you choose. That small pause changes everything, because now you're responding from intention instead of emotion. Most people believe emotional control means suppressing feelings. It doesn't. Emotional control means understanding your feelings without becoming controlled by them. You can feel angry without becoming aggressive. You can feel hurt without becoming desperate. You can feel disappointed without losing your peace. The emotion itself is not the enemy. The loss of self-control is. Ancient philosophers understood this thousands of years ago. They recognized that external events are often beyond our control, but our response remains our responsibility. And that idea is just as powerful today as it was centuries ago. You cannot control what toxic people say. You cannot control what they think. You cannot control how they behave. But you can control whether they gain access to your inner world. That is where your power lies. And here's something most people never consider. When you react emotionally to every negative person, you are allowing strangers to shape the quality of your life. Think about how dangerous that is. A person with poor judgment can affect your confidence. A person with bad intentions can affect your mood. A person who doesn't even know your value can influence how you see yourself. That is too much authority to give another human being. Your emotional state should not be available to the highest bidder. It should not be controlled by whoever speaks the loudest, criticizes the most, or creates the most drama. It should belong to you, and the strongest people understand something that others often miss. Calmness is not weakness. Calmness is control. Anyone can lose their temper. Anyone can react. Anyone can be pulled into chaos. But remaining centered when someone is trying to pull you off balance, that requires strength. That requires discipline. That requires mastery. The reason toxic people become frustrated around emotionally mature individuals is because their usual tactics stop working. The guilt doesn't work. The manipulation doesn't work. The provocation doesn't work. The emotional hooks no longer find a place to attach. And when that happens, the entire dynamic changes. Because the toxic person was never feeding on your logic, they were feeding on your reaction. Remove the reaction, and you remove their fuel. This doesn't happen overnight. It's a skill. It's something you practice every day. You practice it when someone criticizes you unfairly. You practice it when someone misunderstands you. You practice it when someone attempts to provoke you. Each moment becomes an opportunity to strengthen your emotional independence. And over time, something remarkable begins to happen. The people who once controlled your emotions lose their influence. The comments that once ruined your day lose their impact. The situations that once consumed your thoughts lose their grip. Not because the world changed. Not because toxic people disappeared. But because you finally stopped handing them the keys to your peace. And when you stop giving toxic people control over your emotions, you discover a level of freedom that no one can take away from you. Because the strongest person in any room is not the loudest person, the smartest person, or even the most respected person. The strongest person is the one who remains in control of themselves when everyone else is trying to take that control away. Once you understand how to stop giving toxic people control over your emotions, something interesting begins to happen. You start noticing that most toxic interactions follow a pattern. At first, they seem random, they seem personal, they seem unique to your situation. But when you step back and observe carefully, you realize that toxic people often operate from the same playbook. The details change, the strategy doesn't. And that's where the second rule becomes so important: refuse to engage in their games. Because that is exactly what many toxic interactions are. Games. Not conversations, not genuine attempts to solve problems, not sincere efforts to understand each other. Games. The objective is not truth, the objective is control. The objective is not clarity. The objective is emotional dominance. And the reason so many intelligent people get trapped is because they assume everyone is playing by the same rules they are. They enter conversations looking for understanding. The toxic person enters looking for leverage. They enter seeking solutions. The toxic person enters seeking reactions. They enter hoping for resolution. The toxic person enters hoping for control. When you fail to recognize this difference, you end up fighting battles that were never designed to be won. Think about how many arguments begin with a simple comment and somehow escalate into hours of frustration. What happened? The moment you accepted the invitation. That's the part most people miss. Every toxic interaction begins with an invitation. Sometimes it's criticism, sometimes it's an insult, sometimes it's guilt, sometimes it's manipulation. Sometimes it's a sarcastic remark designed to provoke a response. But regardless of the form it takes, the purpose remains the same: to pull you into a game that benefits them and drains you. The challenge is that these invitations rarely look like invitations. They look like obligations. You feel obligated to defend yourself. You feel obligated to explain yourself. You feel obligated to prove them wrong. You feel obligated to make them understand. And before you know it, you're emotionally invested in a battle you never needed to enter. One of the most powerful questions you can ask yourself in these moments is simple. What outcome am I actually trying to achieve? It's a question that instantly exposes whether engagement is useful or pointless. Because many people continue arguing long after the possibility of understanding has disappeared. At that point, the conversation isn't producing clarity, it's producing exhaustion. And there is a profound difference between communication and combat. Communication seeks understanding, combat seeks victory. Toxic people often disguise combat as communication. That's why every response becomes another argument. Every explanation becomes another accusation. Every attempt at peace becomes another opportunity for conflict. The game continues because they need the game to continue. Without the game, they lose access to your attention. Without the game, they lose access to your emotions. Without the game, they lose access to the power they derive from your participation. This is why emotional maturity requires something that many people struggle to accept. You do not have to attend every argument you're invited to. Read that again. You do not have to attend every argument you're invited to. Just because someone wants conflict doesn't mean conflict must happen. Just because someone wants to misunderstand you doesn't mean you must convince them otherwise. Just because someone wants a reaction doesn't mean you have to provide one. In fact, some of the most powerful responses you'll ever give are the responses you never give at all. Now, this doesn't mean becoming passive. It doesn't mean allowing mistreatment. It doesn't mean becoming silent in situations where boundaries are necessary. It means learning the difference between standing up for yourself and becoming trapped in somebody else's drama. Those are not the same thing. A boundary is not an argument. A boundary is a decision. An argument tries to change another person. A boundary changes your participation. And that distinction changes everything. Many people spend years trying to change toxic individuals, trying to convince them, trying to educate them, trying to make them see. But here's a reality that can save you enormous amounts of energy. You cannot force awareness upon someone who is committed to misunderstanding. You cannot force maturity upon someone who benefits from immaturity. And you cannot force accountability upon someone who avoids responsibility. The sooner you accept this, the sooner you stop wasting energy on impossible missions. Instead, you begin focusing on the one thing that is actually within your control, your response, your choices, your participation. And when you stop participating in toxic games, something remarkable happens. The dynamic changes. Not because the toxic person suddenly becomes reasonable, but because the fuel source disappears. Imagine trying to start a fire without oxygen. Eventually it dies. Toxic games work the same way. They require emotional oxygen. They require your anger. They require your defensiveness. They require your frustration. Take those away, and the game becomes difficult to sustain. This is why some people become even more aggressive when you stop reacting. They're not responding to your behavior. They're responding to the loss of control. The tactics that once worked no longer work. The buttons they use to push no longer activate the same response. And that can be deeply unsettling for someone who has spent years relying on those patterns. But stay consistent. Because every time you refuse unnecessary conflict, you're strengthening something far more valuable than the temporary satisfaction of winning an argument. You're strengthening your peace. You're strengthening your discipline. You're strengthening your ability to remain focused on what truly matters. And ultimately that's the goal. Not to win every battle. Not to silence every critic. Not to prove every toxic person wrong. But to stop allowing other people's dysfunction to become your responsibility. Because the highest level of strength is not learning how to defeat toxic people. The highest level of strength is learning when they no longer deserve your participation. And the moment you master that lesson, you stop becoming a player in their game and start becoming the author of your own life. Once you stop giving toxic people control over your emotions, and once you learn how to refuse their invitations into unnecessary conflict, another important realization begins to emerge. You start seeing people more clearly. Not through the lens of what they say. Not through the promises they make. Not through the explanations they offer when things go wrong. But through something far more reliable. Their actions. And that brings us to a lesson that has the power to save you years of confusion, disappointment, and emotional exhaustion. Watch what people do, not what they say. That sounds simple, almost obvious. Yet most people spend a large portion of their lives believing words that are contradicted by behavior. They listen to promises instead of patterns. They trust intentions instead of actions. They focus on what people claim to be rather than what people consistently demonstrate themselves to be. And because of that, they remain trapped in cycles that should have ended long ago. Think about how often someone says all the right things. They apologize beautifully. They explain their behavior convincingly. They promise that things will be different moving forward. For a moment, everything sounds reassuring. You feel hopeful. You want to believe them. After all, believing words is often easier than accepting reality. But reality has a way of revealing itself through repetition. Because character is not displayed in isolated moments. Character is revealed through consistent patterns. Anyone can be kind once. Anyone can be respectful for a day. Anyone can make a promise during an emotional conversation. But very few people can consistently align their actions with their words over time. That is where truth lies. Not in promises, not in intentions. In patterns. One of the reasons toxic people can maintain influence for so long is because they understand the emotional power of words. They know that words can create hope. They know that explanations can create sympathy. They know that promises can buy time. And often, that's exactly what happens. The cycle repeats. A problem occurs. An apology follows. A promise is made. A temporary improvement appears. Then eventually the same behavior returns. The same disrespect. The same manipulation. The same dishonesty. The same emotional games. And yet many people continue focusing on the latest promise rather than the long-term pattern. They keep evaluating the exception instead of the rule. This is where emotional maturity requires a difficult shift. You have to become willing to accept what repeated behavior is teaching you, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's disappointing, even when it forces you to let go of the version of someone you hoped they would become. Because one of the hardest truths in life is that potential is not reality. Who someone could become is not who they currently are. Who someone promises to become is not who they currently are. Who someone repeatedly shows themselves to be is who they currently are. And until their actions consistently change, that reality deserves your attention more than their words. Now, this doesn't mean becoming cynical. It doesn't mean assuming the worst about everyone. It doesn't mean refusing to believe in growth or change. People absolutely can change. People evolve. People learn. People mature. But genuine change has a signature. It leaves evidence. Real change doesn't announce itself constantly. Real change demonstrates itself consistently. You don't have to convince people you've changed when your behavior speaks for you. The evidence becomes visible. The pattern becomes different. The actions tell the story. And that's why emotionally intelligent people pay close attention to consistency. Because consistency is difficult to fake. Words are easy. Promises are easy. Performances are easy. Consistency is hard. Consistency requires character. Anyone can act differently when circumstances are convenient. But who someone becomes under pressure reveals far more than what they say during comfortable moments. Watch how people behave when they don't get their way. Watch how they respond when they're frustrated. Watch how they treat people who can offer them nothing in return. Watch how they handle accountability. Those moments reveal more truth than 1,000 conversations ever could. The philosopher Aristotle once suggested that we become what we repeatedly do. And there is profound wisdom in that idea. Because habits eventually become character. Patterns eventually become identity. Repeated choices eventually define a person. This applies to others. But it also applies to us. And that's an important point. As you become more observant of other people's patterns, you must also become more aware of your own. Because the goal is not simply learning how to identify toxic behavior. The goal is learning how to build trustworthy character within yourself. The same standard you apply to others should also be applied inwardly. Are your actions aligned with your values? Do your behaviors support your words? Can people trust your consistency? Because credibility is built the same way trust is built, one action at a time, one decision at a time, one repeated behavior at a time. And when you begin viewing life through this lens, confusion starts disappearing. Suddenly you spend less time trying to interpret mixed signals. You spend less time overanalyzing contradictory messages. You spend less time hoping reality will become something it has consistently refused to become. Instead, you start accepting evidence. You start trusting patterns. You start making decisions based on what is actually happening rather than what you wish was happening. And that shift is incredibly powerful. Because clarity is one of the greatest forms of freedom. When you see people clearly, you stop wasting energy trying to solve mysteries that have already been answered through behavior. The truth was there all along. Not hidden in their words, not hidden in their explanations, but visible in the choices they repeatedly made. And once you learn to trust actions over promises, something remarkable happens. You stop becoming vulnerable to manipulation disguised as potential. You stop confusing hope with evidence. And you start building relationships based on reality rather than illusion. Because at the end of the day, words may tell you who someone wants to be seen as, but actions reveal who they have chosen to become. And the quality of your life will often be determined by whether you learn to listen to the difference. Once you learn to trust actions more than words, something begins to change inside you. You stop living in confusion. You stop chasing explanations. You stop getting trapped in endless cycles of hope and disappointment. And perhaps most importantly, you begin to understand a truth that many people spend years avoiding. Not everyone deserves unlimited access to your life. That realization leads directly to the fourth rule: protect your peace through boundaries. Now, the moment people hear the word boundaries, many misunderstand what it means. They imagine walls. They imagine distance. They imagine coldness. They imagine pushing people away. But healthy boundaries are not walls, they are filters. They don't exist to keep everyone out. They exist to determine what is allowed in. Think about your home for a moment. You lock your doors at night, not because you hate people, not because you're unfriendly, not because you're selfish. You do it because protection is a form of responsibility. No reasonable person would leave their front door wide open and invite anyone to walk in whenever they pleased. Yet emotionally, many people do exactly that. They allow anyone access to their attention, anyone access to their energy, anyone access to their peace of mind, anyone access to their emotional world. And then they wonder why they feel exhausted. The truth is, every area of life that matters requires boundaries. Your time requires boundaries. Your energy requires boundaries. Your focus requires boundaries. Your relationships require boundaries. Without boundaries, valuable things become vulnerable. And your peace is one of the most valuable things you possess. What makes this difficult is that many good-hearted people have been taught to believe that boundaries are selfish. They've been taught that saying no is rude. They've been taught that protecting themselves is somehow unkind. So they continue sacrificing their well-being in order to keep everyone else comfortable. They tolerate disrespect. They tolerate manipulation. They tolerate constant negativity. They tolerate behaviors that slowly drain their confidence and emotional health. And they do it because they fear disappointing others. But here's an important question. What happens when your desire to avoid disappointing others leads to constantly disappointing yourself? At some point, something has to change. Because every time you say yes to something that violates your peace, you are often saying no to your own well-being. And over time, those decisions accumulate. A single conversation may not seem significant. A single compromise may not seem significant. A single moment of tolerating unhealthy behavior may not seem significant, but repeated over months and years, those moments shape the quality of your life. One of the most liberating truths you can learn is that boundaries are not punishments. They are information. They simply communicate what is acceptable and what is not. A boundary says, this behavior is not something I am willing to participate in. It doesn't attack. It doesn't blame. It doesn't seek revenge. It simply defines where your responsibility ends and another person's responsibility begins. This is where many people get confused. They believe boundaries are about controlling others. They are not. You cannot control another person. You cannot force them to be respectful. You cannot force them to be honest. You cannot force them to be emotionally mature. Boundaries are not about changing their behavior. Boundaries are about changing your response to their behavior. That distinction changes everything, because when you stop trying to control others, you regain control of yourself. And that is where true power exists. The philosopher Epictetus taught that suffering often begins when we focus on things outside our control. There is tremendous wisdom in that idea. Many people spend years trying to manage other people's emotions, other people's choices, and other people's reactions. Meanwhile, they neglect the one thing they actually have authority over: their own decisions, their own standards, their own participation. A boundary is simply the practical expression of that authority. It's saying, I cannot control what you choose to do, but I can control what I choose to allow. And when you begin operating from that mindset, something remarkable happens. You stop feeling trapped. Because toxic people thrive when they believe you have no options. They thrive when they believe you'll tolerate anything. They thrive when they believe your fear of conflict is stronger than your commitment to self-respect. But boundaries quietly disrupt that dynamic. Not through force. Not through aggression. Through clarity. And clarity is powerful. A clear boundary eliminates confusion. It removes ambiguity. It tells people exactly where you stand. Some people will respect that, others won't, and that's important information. Because one of the fastest ways to understand someone's character is to observe how they respond when you establish a healthy boundary. Emotionally mature people may not always like your boundaries, but they respect them. Toxic people often view boundaries as threats. Why? Because boundaries remove access, they remove control. They remove the ability to manipulate without consequences. And that's why some people become angry when you start protecting your peace. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because you're doing something different. You're no longer participating in patterns that benefited them at your expense. And that can be uncomfortable for people who have grown accustomed to unrestricted access. The challenge is remaining consistent. Because boundaries are not built through one conversation. They are built through repeated actions. Anyone can state a boundary once. The real test comes when it must be reinforced, when someone pushes against it, when someone challenges it, when someone attempts to make you feel guilty for having it. That's where your commitment is revealed. Because every healthy boundary ultimately requires courage. The courage to disappoint people, the courage to tolerate misunderstanding, the courage to choose self-respect over approval, and that courage changes lives. Because the quality of your future will largely depend on what you are willing to protect today. Your peace, your focus, your energy, your emotional well-being. These things are too valuable to leave unguarded. And the moment you truly understand that, boundaries stop feeling selfish and start feeling necessary. Because protecting your peace is not an act of rejection. It is an act of self-respect. And the people who transform their lives are not the ones who learn to control everyone around them. They are the ones who finally learn that peace grows wherever self-respect is strong enough to protect it. After you've learned how to stop giving toxic people control over your emotions, after you've refused to participate in their games, after you've trained yourself to trust actions over promises, and after you've built boundaries strong enough to protect your peace, there is one final lesson that ties everything together. In many ways, this is the lesson that makes all the others possible. Because until you understand this truth, toxic people will always have a way of finding a crack in your confidence. The final rule is this: understand that their behavior reflects them, not you. Now that sounds simple, but if fully understood, it can completely transform the way you experience relationships, criticism, conflict, and even your own self-worth. Because one of the greatest mistakes people make is assuming that the way others treat them is an accurate measurement of their value. Someone criticizes them, and they begin questioning themselves. Someone rejects them, and they begin doubting themselves. Someone disrespects them, and they begin shrinking themselves. Someone behaves unfairly toward them, and they begin carrying emotional burdens that never belonged to them in the first place. But let's think carefully about this. If a person walks into a room carrying anger, resentment, bitterness, jealousy, insecurity, or unresolved pain, what are they likely to distribute to the people around them? The answer is simple: whatever is inside them. People can only give from the emotional resources they possess. Someone filled with peace tends to spread peace. Someone filled with respect tends to show respect. Someone filled with confidence rarely needs to belittle others. But someone consumed by insecurity often looks for ways to make others feel small. Someone consumed by bitterness often looks for reasons to criticize. Someone consumed by chaos often creates chaos wherever they go. And yet many people spend years taking these behaviors personally. They assume every insult is a verdict. Every criticism is a truth. Every act of disrespect is proof that something must be wrong with them. But in reality, much of what people do reveals far more about their internal world than it reveals about yours. Think about a mirror for a moment. A mirror reflects whatever stands in front of it. Human behavior often works the same way. The way people consistently treat others reflects the condition of their character. It reflects their values. It reflects their emotional maturity. It reflects their habits of thought. It reflects the battles taking place within them. And once you begin understanding this, something powerful happens. You stop absorbing everything. You stop carrying emotional weight that was never yours to carry. Because not every opinion deserves ownership inside your mind. Not every criticism deserves a permanent residence in your self-image. Not every negative interaction deserves to become part of your identity. This doesn't mean ignoring all feedback. That's not wisdom. Constructive criticism can be valuable. Honest feedback can help us grow. Accountability matters. But there is a profound difference between learning from feedback and defining yourself by someone else's dysfunction. One helps you grow. The other slowly destroys your confidence. Emotionally mature people learn how to separate the two. They ask, is there something useful here for me to learn? If the answer is yes, they learn. If the answer is no, they let it go. What they don't do is automatically accept every negative opinion as truth, because they understand that some judgments reveal more about the judge than the person being judged. History is filled with examples of remarkable individuals who were criticized, misunderstood, rejected, and ridiculed long before they were respected. Not because they lacked value, but because people often evaluate others through the lens of their own limitations. And that's an important thing to remember. Sometimes the criticism you're receiving is not a reflection of your inadequacy. Sometimes it's a reflection of another person's perspective, fears, insecurities, or inability to understand what they are seeing. When you realize this, you stop desperately seeking validation from every person you encounter. You stop making strangers responsible for your self-worth. You stop allowing difficult people to become the authors of your identity. Instead, you begin building something much stronger: internal confidence. And internal confidence is powerful because it doesn't depend on external approval. It remains stable even when someone disapproves. It remains steady even when someone misunderstands. It remains grounded even when someone criticizes unfairly, because it is built on self-knowledge rather than public opinion. The philosopher Marcus Aurelius once wrote that the opinion of 10,000 people is of no value if none of them know the subject. There is tremendous wisdom in that observation. Not all opinions deserve equal influence. Not all voices deserve equal access to your mind. And one of the greatest skills you can develop is learning which voices to listen to and which voices to release. Because if you listen to everyone, eventually you lose the ability to hear yourself. And when that happens, toxic people gain power they never should have had. Power over your confidence. Power over your emotions. Power over your decisions. Power over your future. The goal is not to become indifferent. The goal is to become discerning. To understand that another person's behavior is information, not identity. Their disrespect is information. Their manipulation is information. Their negativity is information. Their actions tell you something important about them. But they do not determine your worth. Your worth existed before their opinion. It exists during their opinion. And it will continue to exist long after their opinion is forgotten. And perhaps that is the deepest freedom of all. Realizing that you no longer need every person to understand you, approve of you, or validate you in order to value yourself. Because when you truly understand that another person's behavior reflects their character more than your worth, something inside you becomes unshakable. You stop reacting to every storm. You stop carrying every burden. You stop believing every accusation. And you start walking through life with a quiet confidence that toxic people cannot control. Because the moment you stop measuring your value through the behavior of broken people is the moment you finally reclaim ownership of your own identity. And when that happens, toxic people lose the only power they ever really had, the power you unknowingly gave them.